and even liberate men from sexual views that only lead to people's oppression. The church continues to be very negative about the body, continues to think that the body, that pleasures need to be very, very much controlled and constricted to clear confines of heterosexual, nuclear, married, and reproductive, and I will add genital because they really would want you to have children as long as it's in marriage. If anything that falls out of that is unacceptable to the church. And as I have been saying in many of my work, that kind of construction of sexuality will make patriarchs and capitalists very happy. So, for example, the nuclear family is a classic situation where a point of extraction of profit, because in my house now, if you come to my house and I'm not exactly part of Manila's top 400, you will see enough equipment, televisions, microwaves, refrigerators, the ordinary stuff that middle class people have, to run a commune. But each of us has that in our house, much to the delight of the capitalists who are selling us these things. If my microwave oven gets busted, I cannot call around and say, who has a similar microwave oven so that I can just cannibalize yours and repair mine and keep this running, and will save both my money and the environment, etc. That's not going to work. The fact that my house is smaller than the one in the back, but bigger than the one to my left, is not an issue. I'm allowed to accumulate tremendous amounts of wealth to the disbenefit of the poor community that's living at the end of our street. Because this is my family, I have a right to give everything. It really creates an ideological and physical infrastructure that accepts inequity. And that would be okay if we're just adults and we learn to live, she has more, she has less. But why are there starving children down our street? Because there's somebody else's nuclear family, not mine. So it's very, very much this idea of traditional family values that the church keeps putting forwards, anchored on this kind of sexuality, is, I would say to the church, even at cross purposes to some of the things it's talking about. And you need to analyze very deeply at this level before you can understand. And that is why the church has to confront its own demons at this point. The idea, for example, that life begins at fertilization, which is currently, I think, the church position. They say it's conception, but conception is not a scientific term. So maybe if I am reading some of the other sentences correctly around this whole issue, they mean fertilization. But fertilization is something we cannot see. There's no way we can know it for that moment. We are also aware that fertilized ova are more likely not to proceed to pregnancy, that fertilized ova can often be found in menstrual blood, that 40 to 60% of fertilized ova just do not implant, and those that implant, you take another half of them don't continue to pregnancy. So we don't understand why the emphasis on this moment. There are other things we need to know. Fertilization is not a moment. From ejaculation to when the sperm cells reach the egg cells, you take a couple of hours, 6 maybe. From the time the sperm cells get to the egg cell, it takes a little time before one sperm cell usually succeeds in penetrating the ova. Before the sperm cell is able to traverse from the outer end of the egg cell to the nucleus of the egg cell, takes a little moment. Before the sperm cell is able to enter the nuclear membrane into the nucleus of the ova, takes a little more time. Before the DNA of the sperm cell and the egg cell merge, takes a little more time. before they begin to work together as one DNA unit takes weeks, not days. So it's not a moment. There's nothing in nature or science that makes it extremely important. Under what definition of potential of life does a fertilized ova have a potential when the large majority of fertilized ova will not become implanted in a pregnancy? The reason why the church likes this procedure is this is the moment where if you define life begins at this point, you control women's bodies, not men's. Because if I were to take the position that life begins with the sperm cell, the priests would be very angry at me. But I'm more likely to see sperm generation than I am to see fertilization. The only practical reason why you should want life to begin there is that it liberates men and gives them bodily freedom, but not women. So these are the interesting ideas about both talking about biology and social construction. Obviously, fertilization begins, but the social construction of fertilization as an important moment is subject to politics, and I would say politics that the church should be ashamed of. That's the one. So, but there are other spin-offs, as I'm saying. If you look at sexuality from the point of view of what would be good for women, for society, there are so many other issues. Adolescents don't have the information they need to be able to enjoy their bodies safely, to be responsible human beings. And I'm not talking about just giving birth. I'm talking about the crazy and bankrupt ideas about love that we keep shoving into the heads of people, and 10 years after, they're sitting in my clinic extremely unhappy about their marriages because they got married for all the most stupid reasons, especially women. Because we keep telling women stupid things about self-esteem, love, and romance that has nothing to do with really learning how to love people and nurturing yourself and another human being in ways that will make you grow together. So this is another area of development and sexuality that is important. We don't have that. So my work has been about issues of the church. It has been issues about adolescent sexuality. It is issues about health programs and how we give reproductive health to people. So that has been my real interest, and still the advocacy both academically and in developmental work. We're not paying enough attention to theorizing how sexuality is part of the systems we have, very much underlies systems we have to change, both at the social and the intimate level, if we're going to see genuine human development. Well, what's interesting, I had a very small article, which small because it was published not in what some people call a reputable academic journal, but I'm very proud of it because we published it as an NGO. Proud of it in two ways. I think it was a great article, the way it was produced, but also because we need also, going back to your question of common platforms and freedom and what is academic, one of our problems, in fact, as a third world academe is that we should not always obey what is acceptable academic literature from the first world academe. A lot of our papers are in community journals with NGOs, written so that you produce a module on sexuality and globalization for a community that breaks it down but doesn't dumb it down. And this is truly important scholarly work. As a person who can also publish in accepted academic journals, but as a person whose early training was how do you teach tuberculosis to an illiterate peasant so that this peasant understands how to be a health worker in their community. Both works are extremely requiring of scholarship and understanding. and equally important to helping people and making the academe accountable to society. So it's not an either or. I love respectable academic journals with 75 well-known references. I love that part. That also excites me when I see these things. But why is it that this other knowledge is so disadvantaged? Going back to that article, I realized after a while, about 5 or 6 years ago, that our advocacy for sexual rights, including the right to sexual fantasies, and the advocacy against consumerist depictions and patriarchal and violent depictions in pornography and media were going to clash at some point at least in the Philippine movement. It hadn't happened yet, at least not in that part of the Philippine women's movement where I live. But I knew that there might be a point where it would clash, because many of my dearest, deepest friends have been working very hard criticizing pornography, and much of it should be criticized indeed. But some of us were already working in sexual reproductive health and rights, and you have a right to your fantasies. Whatever they are, you have a right to your happy, rich, sexual fantasy life. I would make the distinction between fantasizing rape and keeping it to yourself, or someone else who wants to fantasize with you, and actually doing the thing. Those are two diametrically different situations. So what I did, and I'm happy it came together, was call my friends and some of the well-known feminists working on the anti-pornography side and some of the feminists working on the sexual rights side, and we talked. We just put our cards on the table, and I said, look, this is a problem, let's talk about it. And we talked for 3 consecutive evenings till 2 in the morning, with lots of wine, you can imagine, and came up with a monograph, which we published in one of my NGOs. So it's very interesting what we said, for example, about pornography. First of all, we did say that we could not, as feminists, say that we could come to complete agreement about every single sexual portrayal. Not just that whether this is patriarchal, pornographic, unacceptable, but even whether it was boring, exciting, or erotic. Even if we trusted each other completely with what our values, feelings, tastes are, we were sure that there would be many times where someone would say, that is really yucky. And someone will say, it's just boring. Or, no, it's fun. Or, I like it. Okay, so that was the first. Having said that, we were also very sure that we were against censorship, especially of women's issues and sexual portrayals, given that we have a government body who is captured by the Catholic Church and censors who have absolutely no taste in erotica, who have no idea about what is aesthetic, because as far as our censors is concerned, anything slightly sexual is not aesthetic. So we didn't want to give power to a bunch of people who we think are, they say they're hewing to community standards, but we don't know what community they're talking about. Perhaps the community that's in their office. But definitely, we had no acceptance of that censorship. Just as an aside, if you work with women in the communities, they're not afraid of sex. They're not. It's a patronizing, upper class, elitist thing to say that these things are not important to poor women, that they're afraid to talk about it, that they find this bastos. It depends. They're finding it obscene. It depends. It depends on where you're with, if they trust you, how you're approaching them. But it's extremely important to women, and they're not ashamed to talk about sexual matters once you're working with them in a proper context. And the fact that we don't ask is just, I think, patronizing of the censors in even political parties of the left. Okay, so we didn't want censorship to happen in this context. So there are several things also. We think that intellectual products should be differentiated from the production process. Sometimes, if it's a cup of coffee, it's not an intellectual process. We can call for a boycott of the coffee of that particular coffee chain if they're planting rainforests in Brazil in order to fulfill their coffee bean need, because it's not an intellectual product. But we made the distinction between an intellectual product, which we think should not be censored, should be allowed to go down, but the extreme control of the production process. So if you're going to produce sexual depictions of anything, please don't kill the person at the end of the snuff film, really, and we know this happens. Do not exploit children, etc., etc. Okay, so we made that second point. And the third point, one of the points we also made about